Two poor rancher brothers saved an Apache. 20 years later, she returned with an army. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. The sun was setting over the dry plains of the west, casting long shadows over a small, humble ranch. The land was rough and unforgiving, but the two brothers, Jake and Eli Carter, had made a life here, even if it wasn't an easy one. Their ranch, situated on the outskirts of a small town in the heart of the frontier, was barely enough to keep them fed. The brothers had grown up here, working the land their father had left them, learning the harsh ways of survival. But it had never been enough to thrive. Life on the frontier was a struggle, and even the most stubborn could be worn down by its cruelty. The brothers had no one but each other, and for that reason, they worked together like a well-oiled machine, one man's actions syncing perfectly with the other's. One afternoon, while Jake was tending to the cattle and Eli was fixing a fence, they heard a strange sound in the distance. It was faint at first, just a rustling of leaves and the crunch of boots on dry grass. They both paused, senses alert, and then the sound grew louder. Footsteps, dragging, with a soft groan mixed in. It wasn't the sound of an animal, but of a person, someone in distress. Without a word, they both grabbed their rifles and moved toward the noise, finding themselves at the edge of the creek. There, lying half-conscious on the muddy bank, was a young woman, an Apache. She was badly wounded, her clothes torn and bloodied from what appeared to be a vicious attack. Her dark eyes fluttered open as she heard them approach, but she didn't try to move or speak. She just stared at them with fear, her body trembling. Jake, always the more compassionate of the two, knelt beside her, checking her wounds. Eli stood a few paces away, rifle in hand, scanning the area for any sign of danger. They had learned long ago that trust was hard to come by on the frontier, especially when it came to Native Americans. But the sight of the young woman, helpless and alone, tugged at something deep inside them. They had seen enough suffering in their time on the ranch to recognize it when they saw it. Without hesitation, Jake carefully lifted her into his arms, motioning for Eli to follow as they made their way back to the ranch house. They laid her down on a cot, and Eli helped to tend to her wounds as best as they could, despite having little medical knowledge. The night was long, and the woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. They took turns watching over her, each of them wondering what had brought her to this state, and whether or not they had made the right decision in helping her. They didn't know it then, but this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change the course of their lives forever. The woman was an Apache, and the two brothers had just saved her life. What they didn't know was that she was no ordinary Apache. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful chiefs in the region. And her return, 20 years later, would not only bring the brothers a debt they could never repay, but also a new chapter in the long and complicated history between the settlers and the Native American tribes of the West. The night passed slowly at the ranch, the quiet broken only by the wind rustling through the dry grass and the occasional creak of the wooden house settling. Jake and Eli sat by the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. They were both deep in thought, unsure of what to make of the young Apache woman they had rescued. She had been unconscious the entire night, her injuries serious but not immediately life-threatening. The brothers had done their best to clean and bandage her wounds, but the true test would be whether or not she could pull through. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around, disoriented at first. When her gaze met Jake's, there was a flicker of fear, but also a strange recognition, as though she somehow knew who he was. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, just a dry rasp. Jake reached for the water jug beside her cot, gently offering her a drink. She took it gratefully, though she winced in pain as she sat up. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "You saved me," she said, the words heavy with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Jake exchanged a glance with Eli, who stood a little farther away, watching the exchange with cautious interest. Neither of them had expected the woman to wake so soon, or to speak so openly. "You don't have to repay us," Jake replied, his voice steady. "We just did what any decent man would do. You're safe here." The woman's eyes softened, and she seemed to relax for the first time since her arrival. But even as she spoke her thanks, a deep sense of foreboding settled over Jake. There was something about her presence that felt different. She wasn't just another traveler passing through, and her appearance here had to mean something. As the day went on, the brothers went about their usual tasks, but the air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Eli, ever the more practical one, couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the woman recovered. Would her people come looking for her? What kind of trouble would they bring with them? Jake, however, felt a strange sense of peace. He couldn't explain it, but he trusted the woman, even though he didn't fully understand why. Later that evening, the woman, whose name was revealed to be Ayanna, shared her story. She explained that she had been captured during a raid, held captive by a group of men who had no respect for her people. When she had managed to escape, she had been left to fend for herself in the wilderness. The brothers had found her at the brink of death, a casualty of the violence that so often plagued the frontier. Despite the hardships she had faced, Ayanna spoke with strength and resolve. She was proud of her Apache heritage, even if it had brought her pain. She had been taught that honor was everything, and she would rather die fighting than live in captivity. Jake listened intently, though he was troubled by the bitterness that laced her words. Ayanna had clearly been shaped by her experiences in ways that neither of the brothers could fully understand. She had lived through so much, and it showed in her eyes. After the conversation, Eli pulled Jake aside. "What do we do with her now?" he asked, his voice low. "She's not like anyone we've ever met. Her people won't just let her go, especially after what we've done." Jake nodded, deep in thought. He had a sense that the woman's return to her people, when it came, would not be a simple matter. But he wasn't sure how to prepare for the storm that seemed inevitable. What would happen when Ayanna returned to her tribe? Would they see the brothers as saviors, or would they view them as enemies for helping one of their own? Jake wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. The world they had known was about to change forever. The quiet life they had carved out for themselves on the ranch was over, and they would have to face whatever came next, whether they were ready or not. The next morning, as they tended to the cattle and made repairs on the ranch, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Ayanna, having recovered enough to sit up, watched from the porch. Her presence was a constant reminder that the brothers' quiet life was being torn apart by forces beyond their control. They didn't know it yet, but their fates were about to become deeply entwined with Ayanna's. Forces were at play in the distance, and soon enough, they would all be forced to face the consequences of the decision they had made so many hours ago. The days passed slowly, the quiet stillness of the ranch growing heavier with each passing hour. Ayanna's presence, once a distant concern, had become a constant reminder of the complicated future that awaited Jake and Eli. She had recovered from her injuries faster than they had anticipated, and now she spent most of her time sitting on the porch, gazing out over the plains. It was clear that the woman had a strong will, one that had been forged through years of hardship. Yet, as much as she had healed physically, the scars from her past remained. Jake couldn't help but notice the weight of her eyes, as if they carried the burdens of 1,000 untold stories. The brothers, meanwhile, continued their work as usual, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was about to change. The land they worked, once familiar and unchallenged, now felt different. The winds seemed to carry with them the scent of something unknown, a warning, perhaps, of what lay ahead. One afternoon, as Jake was mending a broken fence near the edge of the property, he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. At first, it was just a faint thrum, but it quickly grew louder. It was a sound he knew all too well, a rider approaching fast. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for his rifle. Eli, standing nearby, did the same. They both turned toward the horizon, scanning for any sign of who it might be. As the rider drew closer, Jake could see that it was a lone figure, silhouetted against the setting sun. The rider pulled up just short of the ranch, dismounting with a practiced ease. His face was weathered, his clothes dusty from the long ride. There was something about the way he carried himself that set Jake on edge. The man looked familiar, but it wasn't until he spoke that Jake realized who it was. You boys look like you've been expecting trouble, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. I'm Marshal Voss. I've been tracking someone. Jake and Eli exchanged wary glances. Marshal Voss was a man they'd heard of, but had never had much interaction with. He was known for his dealings with the lawless elements in the area, a man who could be trusted when it came to keeping the peace, or when it suited him. What's the problem, Marshal? Eli asked, keeping his hand near his gun, just in case. I'm looking for a woman, Voss said, his gaze drifting to Ayanna, who had stepped out onto the porch. A runaway. One of your kind. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. Ayanna had been quiet, but her past was something they all knew was inevitable to confront. This was the moment that had been building up for weeks. The Marshal's eyes met Ayanna's, and for a brief moment, there was a tension in the air that could almost be felt. Ayanna's expression was unreadable, but Jake saw a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or anger. She stepped forward slowly, her face hardening. You've come for me, she said, her voice steady, though Jake could hear the undercurrent of emotion in it. I haven't done anything wrong. Voss snorted. That's not for you to decide, he said. The law says you're a fugitive, and I've come to bring you back. Ayanna stood her ground, but Jake could see her hands clench at her sides. The air grew thick with the unspoken words between them. This was no longer just a matter of right or wrong. It was a matter of survival. She's not going anywhere, Jake said, stepping forward, his voice firm. You have no right to take her. Marshal Voss raised an eyebrow, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. I've got every right, he said, and I'll take her whether you like it or not. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire situation could erupt at any moment. Jake and Eli stood ready, their rifles at the ready, but Ayanna spoke before either of them could make a move. Let him come, she said, her voice calm but resolute. It's time to face what's coming. Jake and Eli exchanged a glance. They weren't sure what to expect, but they knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ayanna's past was catching up with her, and with it, a storm that would change everything. As Voss stepped forward, the weight of the moment settled on the brothers. They had chosen to help Ayanna, but now they would have to stand with her against whatever forces were about to descend upon them. The question was no longer whether they could protect their land. It was whether they could protect each other from the tide of fate that was closing in. The sun was low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the land as the wind picked up, whistling through the grass. The air was thick with tension, and the ranch had never felt so alive or so dangerous. Marshal Voss stood there, staring at Ayanna, his face hardened with the weight of duty. The brothers stood beside her, their hands gripping their rifles tightly, their eyes watching every movement he made. Eli's voice was low, almost a growl. We're not letting you take her. Jake, however, said nothing. His gaze locked on Voss. It wasn't just about Ayanna anymore. It was about the land, their family, and the unspoken promise that they would protect anyone who came to them for help. Voss chuckled, a dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. You think you can stop me? I've got the law on my side. He raised his hand slightly, as if to show how simple this was. You're just a couple of ranchers. What can you possibly do? Jake's voice was steady as he spoke. We'll do what we have to. The wind howled louder as if in agreement, pushing the tension even further. Ayanna stood tall between them, her expression unreadable. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She knew what was coming, and she knew that the brothers, no matter how brave, were about to face something far bigger than they ever anticipated. I didn't run to the ranch to hide, Ayanna said quietly, her voice carrying through the air. I came to protect. The words struck Jake like a physical blow, the weight of her meaning sinking in. The marshal's gaze narrowed. Protect, he scoffed. From what? You're a fugitive, and now you're under my custody. But Ayanna's eyes burned with a fire that wasn't going to be extinguished. You think you have the right to bring me in? The Apache don't bow to the law of men like you. Voss stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. I didn't come here to argue. I came to bring her back. And if you boys think you can stop me, well, you're welcome to try. Jake's hand tightened around his rifle, but before he could speak, Eli took a step forward, standing firm between the marshal and Ayanna. We've been living in this country, working this land, for years. We've seen the worst of it. Indians, settlers, lawmen. But we've never seen a man who thinks he can just ride into someone's life and take them away like cattle. His words were slow but full of anger. Voss's eyes flashed, but he didn't move. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, each sizing the other up, testing the limits of patience and pride. Ayana watched them, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. This wasn't just about her, it was about the brothers and their home. She didn't want them to risk their lives for her, but she also knew that the fire inside her could never be extinguished. "Jake," she said softly, her eyes softening as she spoke his name. "Let me handle this. You've done more than enough." Jake turned to her, his expression conflicted. He wanted to protect her, to fight beside her, but he knew deep down that this was her battle now. It was something she had to face on her own. With a sharp nod, he stepped back, and Eli followed suit, though his posture still showed signs of tension. Ayana turned to Marshal Voss, her eyes cold and unyielding. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady. "I'm a fugitive, but not because I'm running from justice." Voss sneered. "Then why?" Ayana took a deep breath, her gaze unflinching. "Because I'm a reminder of the past you want to bury. I'm the truth that you've tried to hide for years. And I will never bow to the men who tried to erase my people." The air crackled with the weight of her words. Voss's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. With a swift motion, he reached for his gun, but before he could draw, a sudden sound broke the tension. Another rider, coming fast from the direction of the creek. Jake's eyes widened as the figure grew larger, and the reality of the situation began to change in an instant. "It's not just you who's come for her," the voice rang out. It was deep and authoritative, unmistakable. Ayana's father, the chief of the Apache, had arrived with a dozen riders, all heavily armed. They had followed the trail for days, and now they had come to settle things once and for all. Voss froze, his hand still hovering over his gun. The two forces stood locked in place, neither side willing to make the first move. The brothers exchanged a glance. This was no longer just a confrontation with a marshal. It was the beginning of something far larger. Ayana's past had caught up with her, and with it, the brothers had been pulled into a battle they could never have imagined. The marshal, now surrounded, could do nothing but watch as the Apache tribe, led by their chief, moved in. The winds shifted once more, and the ranch, which had once felt like home, now felt like the front lines of a war neither side had wanted. The tension in the air was thick as the Apache riders, led by Ayana's father, the chief, surrounded the small group of men. Marshal Voss, his hand still hovering over his holstered gun, knew he was outmatched. The Apache warriors were silent, their eyes cold and calculating, but there was an unmistakable sense of power in their presence. The brothers, Jake and Eli, stood their ground, not knowing exactly what would happen next, but feeling the weight of the moment. Ayana's father, a tall and imposing figure, dismounted from his horse and approached the marshal with a quiet but forceful step. His dark eyes, full of years of wisdom and battle, fixed on Voss with a piercing intensity. "You've come for my daughter," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Voss, still trying to hold on to his authority, attempted to straighten up, but there was a clear hesitation in his movements. "I came to bring her in," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "She's a fugitive. She's breaking the law." The chief's gaze didn't waver. "This land is not your law," he said, his voice rising with quiet strength. "You come here to enforce rules that are not your own. You take what you want and claim it as justice. But we do not bow to men like you." Voss swallowed, but before he could respond, the chief turned toward Jake and Eli, acknowledging them for the first time. "You have shown mercy to my daughter. That is something that will not be forgotten." Jake nodded, still unsure of where this would lead, but sensing the gravity of the situation. He hadn't realized when they had taken Ayana and that they would become part of a much larger struggle. The chief paused, then spoke again, his tone shifting. "But make no mistake, we are not here for mercy. We are here for justice, a justice that is owed." The brothers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that this situation was more complicated than they had imagined. They had already chosen sides by helping Ayana, but now they were caught in a conflict that reached far beyond their ranch. The chief turned back to Voss, his voice growing colder. "You have brought your law to our doorstep, but you have not accounted for the warriors who walk with me." The marshal's face grew pale as the sound of drums began to echo faintly from a distance. Ayana's father didn't flinch. "Your fight is not with us, Marshal. It is with the people who claim this land, who have walked it for generations." Voss took a step back, trying to regain some sense of composure. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. The Apache chief didn't respond immediately. He simply turned and motioned for his warriors to spread out, their movements fluid and purposeful. They weren't here to start a fight, but they weren't leaving without what they had come for. Jake could feel the tension building, the quiet before the storm. He had seen enough of the West's violence to know that it wasn't always the loudest gun that made the difference. It was the one that was fired with purpose. "This is not your battle, Voss," Ayana said, her voice steady as she stepped forward. "You cannot take me back, and you know it. Your laws are not mine." The marshal looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away from everything?" He spat, his voice filled with venom. "Your people have been fighting for years. You think it's just going to end with you?" Ayana's face softened, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet strength. "It ends when we decide it does," she said. The air was heavy with her words, and for a moment, it seemed like time itself had slowed. Voss shifted uneasily, his hand twitching toward his gun. But before he could make a move, the chief raised his hand, and the riders fell into a perfect stillness. It was clear that a line had been drawn, and this was no longer just about Ayana or her father. This was about something much larger, something that had been building for years. "Go back to your town, Marshal," the chief said. "Tell them you have seen the Apache people, and tell them it is not over." The words hung in the air, a challenge that couldn't be ignored. The chief turned and walked back to his horse, and the warriors followed. As they mounted and rode off, the sound of their hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that seemed to reverberate with the weight of history. Voss stood there, his face a mix of frustration and realization. He had come for one thing, but had walked away with something much greater, a lesson in the power of people who would never be silenced. Jake and Eli stood at the edge of the ranch, watching as the Apache left, the horizon stretching before them. They had been caught in a conflict not of their making, but one that would change the course of their lives forever. The question now wasn't what they had done, but what they would do next. The winds of change had swept through their home, and they had no choice but to face the storm head-on. The sound of hooves faded into the distance as the Apache riders disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air. Marshal Voss stood motionless, his hand still resting on the handle of his gun, his eyes fixed on the spot where the Apache chief had stood just moments before. He had been sent to bring Ayana back, to enforce the law as he saw it, but now he was left with nothing but an empty field and the bitter realization that he had failed. The brothers, Jake and Eli, watched from a distance, both of them still processing what had just happened. They had stood side by side with Ayana and her people, but they had also just witnessed the power of a tribe that would not be denied. The question now was what would come next. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The ranch, which had always been their refuge, now felt like a battleground. They had chosen to protect Ayana, but in doing so, they had made enemies of forces much larger than themselves. Eli, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We've got to be ready." Jake nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy. "But we can't turn back now. We made our choice." The brothers knew that they had crossed a line. There was no going back to the way things were. The winds of change had swept through their lives, and they would have to face whatever came next, together. That night, the brothers sat by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Ayana sat with them, her expression distant, but her eyes were full of determination. She had returned to her people, but her heart was still with the brothers who had saved her life. "What happens now?" Eli asked, his voice breaking the silence. Ayana looked at him, her gaze steady. "Now, we prepare," she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "The Apache have long memories. What you did for me will not go unnoticed." The fire crackled as the brothers exchanged a glance. They had always known that helping Ayana would come with consequences, but now they understood that those consequences would be much greater than they had imagined. The next few days were a blur of activity. The brothers worked on the ranch, but their minds were elsewhere. They had learned that their land was no longer just their own. It was part of a larger conflict, one that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Word had spread, and it wasn't long before strangers began appearing at the edges of their property. Some were settlers looking for work, others were curious, but all of them brought with them the same unspoken question. What would the brothers do now? It wasn't just the Apache that they had to worry about. Voss had left, but he wasn't the only lawman in the area. The government was watching, and the brothers knew that they would soon have to answer for their actions. Jake and Eli continued to work the land, but they both knew that they were living on borrowed time. The day came when a group of soldiers arrived at their doorstep. They were led by a man with a badge, his face stern and unreadable. "We've come to speak with you about your involvement with the Apache," the man said, his voice cold. Jake and Eli stood in silence, knowing that there was nothing they could do to change what had already been set in motion. The soldiers didn't come for a fight, not yet. They were there to deliver a message. "You've taken sides," the soldier continued, his eyes narrowing. "And now you will face the consequences." The brothers knew that the real battle was just beginning. The forces that were closing in on them were not just physical, they were ideological. The settlers, the lawmen, and the Apache were all playing their parts in a larger game, one that neither side fully understood. As the soldiers turned and left, the brothers stood on the porch, the weight of the world bearing down on them. They had chosen to help Ayanna, and in doing so, they had made themselves a part of something much larger than their quiet ranch life. Jake looked at Eli, his expression grim. "We can't back down," he said, his voice steady. "Not now? Not after everything that's happened?" Eli nodded, his eyes hardening. "I know," he said. "We stand with her, whatever comes next." And so, the brothers prepared for what was to come. They knew that they couldn't face it alone, but they also knew that the choices they had made had set them on a path from which there was no turning back. The winds had changed, and the storm that was brewing on the horizon was about to hit. What they didn't know yet was how much they would lose in the process, and how far they would have to go to protect the land they had fought so hard to build. Days passed with increasing tension, as the brothers prepared for whatever would come next. The soldiers who had visited were just the beginning. Word was spreading fast, and every day brought new challenges, new threats. Jake and Eli continued to work the land, but their minds were consumed with worry. The quiet life they had fought so hard to build was unraveling before them, and they had no idea how far it would go. Ayanna, ever watchful, had retreated to her cabin on the edge of the ranch, her mind seemingly elsewhere. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate their help. She did, but the fire that burned inside her had never been about safety or comfort. It had always been about survival. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ayanna came to the brothers, her expression serious. "We need to leave," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had made up their mind. Jake and Eli exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew there was truth in her words. "The Apache are on the move," she continued. "We can't stay here, not with the soldiers closing in and the settlers watching. If we stay, we'll be caught in the middle of something we can't control." Jake shook his head, a sense of dread building in his chest. "Where would we go? We've made our stand here." Ayanna's eyes hardened, her gaze unwavering. "You can stay here, if you choose, but you'll be making yourselves targets. The law will come for you, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. The Apache won't back down, and neither will the settlers. This is your choice, but know this, it will end in blood if you stay." Eli stepped forward, the practicality in his nature taking over. "So what are you saying? We just pack up and run?" Ayanna nodded, her expression still grave. "You don't have to run forever. But for now, we need to get out of here, gather our people, and figure out what comes next. If we stay, the fight will find us, whether we want it to or not." The brothers were silent for a long moment, the weight of Ayanna's words sinking in. This was no longer just about saving one woman. It was about survival, about standing against forces that had long ago drawn their lines in the sand. Finally, Jake spoke. "All right, we'll leave. But where do we go from here?" Ayanna gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was one full of resolve. "There's a place, far to the north. A safe haven for those who need it. We can regroup there, and then we'll decide what to do next." With no time to waste, The brothers gathered what they could, packed up their things, and made the difficult decision to leave their land behind. They saddled their horses, said their goodbyes to the ranch, and followed Ayana into the unknown. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but deep down, they knew it was the only way to survive. The journey north was long and grueling. They rode through dusty plains and rugged hills, constantly on the lookout for anyone who might be tracking them. Ayana led the way, her knowledge of the land guiding them through hidden paths and unmarked trails. The brothers, though weary, knew they had made the right choice. They couldn't fight the tide of history, but they could choose where to stand. Days turned into weeks, and the weather began to change. The air grew colder, and the landscape shifted as they approached the northern border of the land they knew. It was a place that would offer them refuge, but it was also a place of uncertainty. No one knew what awaited them there. The further they traveled, the more they realized that they were not just running from something. They were running towards something. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had Ayana's people, the Apache, who would stand with them. As they crossed into the land where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, the brothers understood that their journey had only just begun. They were no longer just ranchers. They were survivors, drawn into a fight that transcended their quiet lives. The storm they had been warned about was coming, and they had no idea how it would end. But one thing was certain, they would face it together. The journey north was harder than any of them had anticipated. The days were long, the nights colder, and the landscape changed around them as they moved further away from the land they had once called home. Jake and Eli, though accustomed to the harsh life of ranching, felt the strain of constant movement. They were no longer working the land. They were surviving. Ayana, however, seemed to be at ease in this wilderness. She had grown up navigating these terrains, knowing where to find water and shelter, understanding the land in a way that the brothers could only begin to grasp. Still, there was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense that they were being watched. The brothers couldn't shake the feeling that they were being tracked. Their every move seemed to be scrutinized, though they never saw anyone. Ayana had said little about what lay ahead, only that they were heading for a place where they could rest, where the Apache could regroup. But Jake could sense there was more to it than that. As the days passed, they grew closer to the northern border. The land became more rugged, the mountains looming in the distance like silent sentinels. The winds were colder here, and the nights grew darker earlier, but the brothers had no choice but to keep moving. They had crossed into unfamiliar territory, and they could feel the weight of their decision pressing down on them. They were far from home, and there was no turning back now. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the landscape in a soft orange glow, Ayana stopped. Her sharp eyes scanned the horizon, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. She looked back at Jake and Eli, a serious expression on her face. "We're close," she said, her voice low. "But you need to be prepared. Once we reach the camp, things will change. This is no longer just about survival. It's about making a stand." The brothers exchanged a glance, unsure of what she meant. They had been making a stand from the moment they had helped Ayana, but they knew there was more to this journey than they understood. Ayana had been quiet for most of the journey, but now she seemed to be preparing them for something bigger than themselves. The Apache were not just running, they were gathering, and Jake could feel the tension in the air growing. The next morning, they reached a clearing on the edge of a dense forest, where a small camp had been set up. The camp was hidden well, surrounded by tall trees and a thick underbrush that provided cover. It was a place that looked abandoned at first, but Jake soon realized it was anything but. Ayana walked ahead of the brothers, her eyes scanning the area as she approached the fire. "Welcome to the heart of the Apache resistance," she said quietly. "This is where we'll make our stand." The camp was small, but it was well equipped. There were warriors scattered about, some sitting around the fire, others sharpening weapons or tending to horses. Jake and Eli's presence was met with wary looks at first, but Ayana spoke to them in their language, and soon the tension seemed to ease. The brothers realized that this place was more than just a refuge. It was a place of strategy, a place where the Apache could plan their next move. The chief, Ayana's father, was here, along with several other leaders of the tribe. It was clear that this was the gathering point for something much larger. Ayana led them to the chief, who was sitting by the fire, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "You've come far," he said in a gravelly voice, his eyes scanning the brothers. "I know you. Did not come for war, but war has found you." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "We didn't come here to fight. We just wanted to protect her." The chief smiled grimly. "You have protected her, and for that, we are grateful. But now you must understand that protecting her, and protecting what is ours, comes at a cost." Eli stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What does that mean? What's the cost?" The chief leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "It means we stand together. No one can fight this battle alone, and we will need every hand if we are to win. You have chosen a side, and that side is now ours. Whether you are ready or not, this war will change you." The words hung heavy in the air. The brothers knew that they had made a decision they couldn't undo. They had chosen to stand with Ayanna, and now they were part of something much larger than themselves. The weight of the situation began to settle on their shoulders. The Apache were not just fighting for their land, they were fighting for their very existence. Jake and Eli looked at each other, their faces serious. They had come so far, and there was no turning back now. They had joined the fight, and together, they would see it through. The fire crackled as the night grew darker, and the brothers, now a part of the Apache resistance, prepared for what lay ahead. They had left everything behind, and now they had to stand together, with Ayanna and the Apache, against the forces that would stop at nothing to take it all away. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jake and Eli had joined the Apache resistance, but they weren't yet fully prepared for the storm that was coming. The brothers, once simple ranchers, now found themselves deep within a struggle that spanned far beyond their understanding. They had chosen to fight for Ayanna, and in doing so, they had committed themselves to a cause that would change everything they knew. As they spent more time with the Apache, they saw the depth of the fight ahead. They learned the stories of those who had been displaced, families torn apart, and lives lost. The Apache had lived through generations of hardship, but now they were facing the most significant battle yet. Jake and Eli had no illusions about what was at stake. The chief, Ayanna's father, had made it clear that this was a fight for survival, not just for their land, but for their way of life. The Apache warriors trained tirelessly, preparing for the inevitable clash. The brothers, though new to this world, did what they could, helping with the horses, securing supplies, and learning to fight. But the reality of war was stark, and they knew that they were about to face something far greater than they had ever imagined. One evening, as the camp sat around the fire, the mood grew somber. The soldiers were getting closer, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the battle would begin. Ayanna stood before the gathered warriors, her presence commanding respect. She had become more than just a woman on the run. She had become a leader, a symbol of strength for her people. "We are not fighting for revenge," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We are fighting for our future, for the freedom to live our lives as we see fit. This is not just about the past. It's about what we will leave behind for our children. We cannot let them erase our history." Her words resonated deeply with the brothers. They had come to this fight not just to protect Ayanna, but to stand for something greater. They understood now that this was not just a battle for land. It was a battle for dignity, for a people who had been forced to live on the margins for too long. The day of the battle arrived with a quiet that seemed unnatural. The wind had died down, and the sky hung heavy with the promise of violence. The Apache had set their defenses, and the brothers stood alongside them, ready to face the soldiers. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of what was to come pressing down on them all. As the first soldiers appeared on the horizon, a wave of anticipation rippled through the camp. The brothers had never seen anything like it, the calm before the storm, the feeling that everything had led up to this moment. The soldiers rode in slowly, their numbers overwhelming. They were well-trained and well-armed, and it seemed as though they had come to crush any resistance. The Apache, however, stood firm. The warriors mounted their horses, their faces grim and resolute. Ayanna stood at the front, her gaze unwavering. She had fought for this moment, for the chance to defend her people, and now it was time to act. The battle began with a thunderous roar, the sound of gunfire, and the clash of steel filling the air. The Apache fought with everything they had, using their knowledge of the land and their guerrilla tactics to strike quickly and disappear into the shadows. Jake and Eli found themselves in the thick of it, riding alongside the Apache warriors, their rifles raised, fighting not just for survival, but for the future they had chosen. The battle raged on for hours, each side pushing and pulling, the land itself seeming to tremble beneath the weight of the conflict. But slowly, the Apache began to push back, their warriors fighting with a fierce determination that matched the strength of their cause. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was strewn with the aftermath of violence. The soldiers had retreated, but not without heavy losses. The Apache had won this battle, but at a great cost. The brothers stood side by side, breathing heavily, their bodies sore from the fight. They had fought alongside Ayanna and her people, and though they had been changed by the experience, they felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Ayanna stood nearby, her face a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She looked at the brothers, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," she said quietly. "But this is just the beginning. We've won today, but the fight is far from over." Jake and Eli nodded, understanding now more than ever the gravity of what lay ahead. They had been part of something much larger than themselves, a fight for survival, for justice, and for the future of a people who had been wronged for far too long. As they looked out over the battlefield, they knew that their journey was not over. The winds of change had blown through their lives, and there was no going back. But one thing was certain, they would face whatever came next together, with the strength of their choices and the bond they had forged in the heat of battle. Immerse yourself in the world of gripping Western stories that explore the raw and unforgiving landscapes of the American frontier. In these tales, too, rancher brothers find themselves caught in the middle of a battle for survival when they choose to protect an Apache woman on the run. As the conflict escalates, they join the Apache in their fight for freedom, facing soldiers and settlers determined to crush their resistance. These Western stories are filled with moments of intense action, deep emotional connections, and moral dilemmas as the brothers, once simple ranchers, become heroes in a war they never expected. From the early days of survival to the explosive battles on the frontier, these Western stories showcase the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. As the brothers stand side by side with the Apache, they learn that their fight is not just about survival. It's about standing up for justice in a world that often demands sacrifice. The choices they make will shape their destinies and determine the future of the land they've come to call home. These Western stories are filled with unexpected twists, compelling characters, and the timeless themes of loyalty, bravery, and redemption. As the brothers face the consequences of their actions, they realize that the fight is far from over, and the battle for their survival is only just beginning. Through it all, they discover what it truly means to fight for something greater than themselves in these unforgettable Western stories.